Hi, and welcome back to Hope 2020. Our next speaker, David City, will be presenting Hackers and the Arms Race for Privacy. David is a PhD student of information at the University of Arizona. David, thank you very much for being with us today, and we really appreciate you coming and sharing with us.
Thanks very much. I'm happy to be here. My talk is Hackers and the Arms Race for Privacy. Before I get into it, I wanted to point out that I have a link here on my slides, which includes the outline for much of what I'll be saying. I want to include that in case you are not an auditory person or you'd otherwise benefit from seeing the words. So I'll hew pretty close to these words that are shared on this under this PDF here. But if you want to go and get it, it's available for everyone. Okay. Cheap personal computers in the 80s and 90s brought computing into private life for the first time. Behold, the Altair 8800, one of the earliest personal computers. And in a nice bit of foreshadowing, it had previously been called the little brother. So pioneers of personal computing heralded a revolution. This is familiar. The beginning of a new age. Now the computer would serve the individual, inverting its reputation as a tool for institutions seeking to reduce everyone to a number. It'd be less than 10 years until those themes of empowerment were revisited again as the internet started connecting networks of computers to each other. And there was a democratization of access to information resources that had previously only been available to powerful organizations. Now the individual user was a prolific producer of personal information online. And that personal information was increasingly available to a broad range of actors, including both private firms and public governments. So soon, information privacy came to occupy a central role on the internet. In practical terms, one result of individual users seeking to control their personal information online was the development of personal privacy enhancing technologies, or PETs. And those soon came to be locked in an arms race with technologies for circumventing privacy protections. As in other cases of one-upsmanship, like the humiliating result of sexual selection seen here, the cumulative effect of the privacy arms race was disfiguring to the original vision of computing and the internet. Worse still, personal pets haven't really been effective. The arms race has left us with eroding privacy for years as powerful actors have sought to dominate the space, either in the market or in the military sense of the word. From a military perspective, you have General Michael Hayden, who's the former director of the CIA and NSA, and a kind of apologist for the intelligence community after the Snowden revelations, who articulated the official position that the internet is not a digital Eden, but Mogadishu. This is Mogadishu, a domain to be dominated. From the commercial perspective, you have companies consolidating users to capitalize on network effects, resulting in a few very dominant services. Again, this is familiar. You can't blame people for having their perspective, of course, with their own sets of goals and priorities, but we've got to have ours as well. The internet should be a place where it's hard to violate people's privacy, where there's a space to do stuff without it having commercial or political consequences, where activity can be free of scrutiny for intelligence value or legality for the innocent. That's central to the internet's promise as an idea. So I'm going to argue that it's time to take a long-term perspective on privacy to defend those early ideals by focusing on the arms race dynamic itself from a design perspective. That means thinking less about personal privacy enhancing technologies, which tend to make kind of privacy mall ninjas out of us, and towards distributed technologies that are designed to impose costs for trying a privacy attack, and so have a more systematic effect. That is to say, I think it's time that we start thinking about strategic PETs, strategic privacy enhancing technologies. Strategic PETs come in pairs. There are transparency technologies, which are important to ongoing and timely identification of privacy attacks and the measurement of the attack's severity. And there are what I'll call screw you defenses, which impose costs for attacks rather than just repelling them. So this is a screw you defense is intended to discourage new attacks and to weaken privacy attackers against competing approaches that provide close substitutes but are more private. And the name just comes from this effect in psychology where people agree to be participants in a study, but are reactant rather than compliant to to the protocols. And so they try to thwart what they believe to be the purpose of the study. So well known, it's actually a known effect. Oops, excuse me. So the operators of strategic pets need to have a certain character. The first important trait is independence. People, mostly lawyers and policy people who I know, can sometimes say that privacy technology is a kind of fig leaf against organized efforts by powerful actors. And they conclude from that that we need privacy regulation instead. That's where our attention should be. But paraphrasing Dan Geer, who's shown here, who's the former head of In-Q-Tel, which is the venture capital arm of the intelligence community, apparatchiks and optimists about governments and companies' ability to grade their own work and restrain activities that would otherwise serve their mission might like that kind of regulation approach. But hackers who tend to be pessimists in that respect will want to be more direct. The second trait is bravery, and that's because operators and developers of strategic pets run the risk of being targeted, and there's a cost associated with that, of course. So the tools can be designed with that risk in mind, and they should be, and we're going to talk about it. And that may involve some more traditional kinds of pets, in particular anonymity networks. But, you know, no matter what, nothing is perfect.
At our broadcast booth, and they are resetting, and I'll give
You're
you
good.
that.
Please resume.
Shall I go back a little bit or from where it was?
Couple sentences. It didn't crash for very long.
Okay.
Okay.
So to paraphrase Dan Geer, who's shown here, he's the former head of In-Q-Tel, which is the venture capital arm of the intelligence community. Apparatchiks and optimists about governments and companies' ability in general to grade their own work and restrain activities that would otherwise serve their mission, they might like the regulation approach. But hackers who tend to be pessimists in that respect will want to be more direct. So the second trait that I think operators and developers of SPETs need is bravery. There's a risk in running SPETs of being targeted, and there's a cost associated with that, even if the targeting isn't successful. So the tools that we're going to talk about can be designed with those kinds of risks in mind, and that might involve incorporating some traditional pets, in particular things like anonymity networks. But attacks on this sort of smaller group of SPET operators are still going to be a risk. So to sort of put it in a sentence, you could say the safest way to practice free speech is still abstinence. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing what we're doing with strategic pets. The final trait I'll mention is practicality. So all those years ago, Ian Goldberg gave a sequence of sort of surveys of the landscape of privacy technology. They were separated by about 5 years each. And they all included in one way or another the observation that a lot of great, interesting privacy research is being done, but only a tiny fraction of it ever becomes practical enough for any kind of adoption. The incentives aren't really right for academics to follow through all the way to deployment of their research once it's been developed enough for publication. But adoption should be a central goal for strategic pets from the beginning, with the focus on resourcefulness, hacking together using existing tools. So that's why you, JRandom hacker, matter. These are hacker traits, at least in my own experience, and there's a need for them. So this gives a different form of the kind of public interest technologists that Bruce Schneier's pushed for a few years now and others. But I think it's a little more important than advising lawyers and senators on technical issues, although that's important too, it has its role. So this is a kind of call to you in a sense. Okay, so let's look at some of these strategic pets in more detail. As I said, they come in pairs with transparency technologies seeking to identify and measure severity of privacy attack, and screw you defenses imposing costs. All right, we'll start with transparency technologies. Transparency technologies have the character of honeypots sometimes. They're the kind of opposite of traditional disclosure minimization hard pets, in that their value is precisely in being attacked. Attack is what enables good measurement. But they're also not, that the fact that they're not hard pets does not mean that they're sort of the other traditional side of the distinction, which is soft pets, since those tend to involve a lot of trust assumptions. They're really their own thing, separate from the distinctions traditionally applied to traditional personal pets. Okay, so the first category of strategic pet is trader tracing tools. The idea there is basically to let you attribute oversharing as an attack on privacy, to know who it is that's shared something that you didn't want them to share so widely. The easiest example is a service collecting an email address. So here, there's a Facebook captive portal. You might recognize it if you ever used a Pineapple. I think this is one of the standard templates that they use on the Pineapple. But it's also a legitimate login for a captive portal that might be used to access some coffee shop's website. Some coffee shop's Wi-Fi. And so the coffee shop might take in your email address and then share it excessively. Another kind of example might be giving an email address to sign up for two-factor and then having it shared. Both of those, by the way, have already happened. So this isn't some hypothetical. And there are many more examples. It's familiar. One transparency response is to provide a fingerprinted email address in cases like this. So there's already an existing way to do this. One way to go is to just serialize the identity of the party you're giving. You're giving the address to in the local part of the email. So here we have Joe's Coffee stuck there in the first part of the local part of the email. And then use the other half of the local part, which is here foobar, as a pseudonym that determines where the mail sent to that address gets forwarded to. So then receiving email from anyone but Joe's Coffee at that address, which you specialized for Joe's Coffee, reveals that Joe's Coffee is sharing. There are several usable services out there for doing this, including Spam Gourmet, which is the logo there, wonderful spam, and 33mail. You could also do something yourself that's a little more interesting, like roll a mail server and have some domain churn using afraid.org and try and do something to avoid blacklisting and things like that. The problem with these centralized services that already exist will be familiar to anonymity researchers, compulsion, basically. They're in the position of old school type 0 remailers. So they're subject to the same problems as a non-pennant FI was way back when. And less way back when, the same problems that RiseUp and LavaBit had faced, which is you can get hit with a court order or threatened in some other way and be forced to reveal the mapping from a pseudonym to the forwarding email address. Right? Centralized. The second challenge is to proactively, so that's the first challenge, is to sort of distribute. The second challenge is to proactively find services that are performing this kind of attack. So remember, this isn't a personal pet that you're using for your own purposes, so you can get something you want in a more private way. This is an auditing tool. So you want to go out and know what the state of things is for that particular service, like the web or Wi-Fi. So basically the challenge is to do fingerprinted email forwarding right, to drive around a bot, to sign up for things, provide fingerprinted but not recognizable email addresses, that is addresses that aren't recognizable as fingerprinted, and to see what sharing is revealed by what comes in the mail, all automatically and while protecting the forwarding agent from compulsion. So that's the kind of the gauntlet for the strategic version of this existing stuff. All right, next one I want to talk about, so this is the role of the automation and the bots. The next thing I want to talk about are observational studies. The idea here is to treat a service like a website as a black box, so not to analyze its internal behavior, but just observe it externally, and to record what it does without intervening or trying to control any variables. So we're basically in the lower right of this diagram, which is from a paper, actually, which is not a monitoring paper. It's on experimentation, information flow analysis and experimentation by Michael Shantz. But we're basically in the lower right. We're not analyzing internal behavior and not exercising any control. So the easiest example is browser fingerprinting. The website, if you're not familiar, the website makes a bunch of requests for values that separately have some legitimate uses. So showing a video at the right size or rendering a font properly, for example. But together, the requests that are made are unique for the browser or close enough so that a site measuring them on visitors gains this kind of stateless tracking of a visitor's identity, it can take the identity off of them. So here's an example of this by Anupam Das and friends, which shows third parties on a website. For listing 5, the website's Reuters.com, it's a news website. And there's a third-party advertiser who's recording very fine-grained details from the sensors on a mobile device. So they were interested to see whether this kind of attack was happening, to use the sensor values as fingerprinting for fingerprinting, and they found that it was. And listing 6, similarly, there's a New Zealand website, stuff.co.nz, where again, orientation data is being sent to a third-party advertiser. So one response to this kind of thing has been to build bots with an instrumented browser that records requests that are fingerprint-like. So that's what OpenWPM does. That's a rather large project now. I think it's under Mozilla. It started out at, I think, Princeton. Fingerprint.js can be used to sort of audit how well you're doing at avoiding being detected being detected as measuring fingerprinting. And so there's a mature tool here, like in the previous cases. But the SPET challenge is, again, to prevent compulsion for those who are running this kind of bots. So an instrumented browser, for example. For academic research, the incentive to go after authors is pretty low. So academics usually don't do much to protect their anonymity in cases like this. These authors didn't really, for example. But for a SPET, anonymity is going to be important. So adapting frameworks like OpenWPM to work with better anonymity is an important goal. Also, on the theme of practicality, another SPET consideration is that these projects need to continue to work, unlike a research project, once it's in the state where it can be published, can be left as an artifact. But that maintenance presents some challenges, especially for fingerprinting, where you have these movements under Google, for example, to give greater capabilities to the browser, which is exactly the sort of source of individuating information that you would need for fingerprinting. The last sort of additional thing a SPET would need in this kind of context is to audit for changes in behavior by the site that indicates that it has detected it's being monitored. So again, academics don't really need to they only need to demonstrate an issue. So if you miss an edge case, which is some site that has some very sophisticated countermeasures in place, it's not a big deal. But for a SPET, those are the cases that are most interesting and important. So it's really important to be at the forefront there, as it were. So if you detect another kind of arms race here, which I mentioned, since the title is arms race, with fingerprint detectors that are then detected by fingerprint detectors, you're right, and I'll get back to it. So another kind of slightly sensitive issue, because it's personal for many, and that always brings up the most controversy, is the issue of capture of privacy research or projects via hiring. So I think of this as a kind of new manifestation of the notorious embrace, extend, extinguish idea that came out of Microsoft. I paused before including this, even though I think it justifies some discussion, because there's lots of people who I respect who are doing things that fall under this broad rubric. But I think you don't come to hope to mince words with ambition and avoid things that need to be discussed. So I think we should discuss this. Anyway, on this attack, a company offers a good salary and a role in a privacy-related research arm to the leads of some project, like here at Google or here at Facebook, and emphasize things like their commitment to improving privacy and how influential their platform is and what kind of practical real-world difference you can make there. So what I want to point out here is that even if the researcher's work continues unchanged after receiving funding of this sort, which I think does happen in many cases, many privacy researchers are very committed to their work. But even if they are unchanged, the question has to be asked, why is funding in this public way worth it to these companies? One possibility is that, this is related to something I was saying before, which is that researchers are unlikely to produce deployed systems that would impact the privacy attacks on the ground that these companies are so invested in. So there's a kind of good trade-off between the likely public relations benefit of publicly supporting privacy researchers, especially famous ones, and the risk that they're going to undermine, your business. So tool-wise, the existing ones are sort of orthodox tools for scraping, such as ScrapeEye. And those could be used to just get the names of participating privacy researchers, maybe learn about how their research has evolved and do a little analysis of before and after they've received funding. But again, even if it hasn't changed, I think there's another issue here to be addressed. And so technically, the sort of same issues for strategic versions of the scraping would be what we've seen before. Essentially, there needs to be some additional anonymity provided, and there needs to be some attempt to conceal that a scraper is operating in order to get real results and be useful. Okay, the next example of a transparency tool is one used for compulsion resistance. So I've talked about this in different ways, but here the issue is tools that reveal excessive secrecy imposed by legal means. So here it's sort of a governmental thing more that I have in mind. So an example is the gag order that comes with national security letters. So here's an example of one that you see. And those prevent timely disclosure to anyone that the letter had been received, except maybe the recipient's lawyer and the agents that are directly needed to execute the search. And gags don't only come with national security letters. People sometimes forget there's other legal processes like FISC orders or warrants from the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which have been historically very important. So the official means of transparency for these kinds of things are the sort of coarsened form of release, where there's bins of, the smallest bin size is 250 orders. And so you can release which of the bins you fall in every 6 months. So you can say 0 to 250, 251 to 500, and so on. So that official transparency channel is still very opaque. And I think, the long-term privacy perspective stretches into the future, and that's the way I've been emphasizing, but it also stretches backwards. And it's worth noting that the secret FISC orders, that's Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, that's the secret court that rules on a lot of these issues. Those secret FISC orders that authorized collection on many individuals at once, or that left a lot of discretion to agents in determining whether legal standards are being met, those were a legacy of the Snowden revelation. So that came out. And those wouldn't have been caught by these binned semi-annual reports. So you might say, with Dan Geer, again, we have reason to be pessimistic about the sort of official channels. The existing technology here to build on are warrant canaries. So a warrant canary is like a published statement, sometimes with some verifiable authenticity and indication of timeliness, that states that a gagged legal process hasn't been received. Once that changes, the legal process has been received with a gag, the canary is either removed entirely or its timeliness verification is allowed to lapse. So you sometimes say that the canary dies, indicates there's a problem. The strategic addition to these existing technologies is to target something more particular and problematic in the practices. So I've given a couple of examples of that already, but it's a kind of broader problem to say what those are, how to craft a warrant canary with the appropriate sorts of assurances and specificity that could be useful for transparency purposes. This is the kind of place where I think technologists should be interacting with policymakers, lawyers, and historians of information privacy to sort of come to an informed idea about what to do. Another kind of more technical issue is to manage the canaries. So canarywatch.org, which is the organization with the logo you see here, existed for only a year. It shut down in 2016, citing uncertainty in how to interpret dead canaries. So management of the canaries to avoid the kinds of problems Canary Watch found is a strategic challenge. That's you need to take the burden of managing these warrant canaries out of the hands of the individual services, beyond maybe just affirming or failing to affirm that they've received a legal process. There's plenty of questions here, but I think it's a rich area, and I think it's something that could have good strategic effect. The last thing I'll mention before moving on is that there's a need to handle further compulsion in the form of legal challenge to the uses of canaries that I've described. So if canaries become more effective as strategic pets, that's going to be something that happens, right? You're going to expect there are going to be more challenges to their use. Right now, they haven't been challenged in court that we know of, but it's an open question how well they'll do. So design-wise, it would be prudent to build in some protections, to have a distributed design, and to include a variety of legal jurisdictions in the functioning of the system. Okay, so summary for transparency technologies: strategic pets come in pairs. Transparency technology is the first half, which helps to identify and measure the severity of privacy attacks. The emphasis is on simple automated tools here and elsewhere that do something narrow relatively well and can be fully deployed. It's important to have ongoing and distributed measurement to maintain accountability for privacy attack. That's sort of central to transparency technology's purpose. We talked about trader tracing, observational studies, and compulsion resistance as areas where you could look to sort of start making some progress in this area. Okay, screw you defenses are the other part of SPETS, which impose some kind of cost for attempting a privacy attack. The most obvious screw you defense is noise injection. So that's essentially misrepresentation of the attributes that are subject to privacy attack. It's sometimes takes the form that you want to misrepresent in a way that is particularly attractive to a target in order to kind of maximize the wasted resources. It's a sort of a sticky honeypot kind of model. You could think of this as kind of the complement to the idea that you never know when you're being watched, which is that you never know when you're being lied to. This is weaponized garbage in and garbage out to waste resources. An easy example of this, maybe as familiar, is Ad Nauseam. Ad Nauseam is a browser extension developed by Daniel Howe and Helen Nissenbaum, which clicks randomly on the ads on a page and also optionally blocks them for the viewer and does a few other things. The strategic addition to this, so obviously that's problematic from the perspective of predicting a person's purchase behavior based on their click behavior, right? You're introducing a lot of noise. I still think of that as a proto screw you defense. It's not quite a full SPET yet because there needs to be some additional automation and targeting of its use. So a bot that was guided by transparency pets towards sites that were offending could then access a privacy attacker's site and preferentially visit those sites and click randomly to reduce the value of tracking on that site or of advertising on that site. I just want to pause here and note, so this is the bot's point again. I just want to pause here and note that that Daniel Howe is an artist, among other things, and that several artists have undertaken projects that I would consider proto-SPETs. And I was reflecting on that the other day, why that might be. And I think it's probably because SPETs are a kind of use of free expression to protect privacy. And that's a rich area for exploration, for an artist especially. So here I picked out a few that I thought of as good examples. Let's see, starting in the upper left, you have Daniel Howe, very upper left corner. And then clockwise, we've got Trevor Paglen, the Yes Men, three people whose names are all Janez Janša. That's sort of part of the performance. They all named themselves after a Slovenian politician. and then worked together. And then Ben Grosser. Okay, so a different kind of example of noise injection might focus on email-based privacy attacks. So this is, again, probably familiar. There's a kind of deceptive tracking that goes on in email where the email body has links in it whose text doesn't match their target. So when you click the link, you're sent not where you expect to go, but to some third party while carrying some payload of your personal information. And the third party then happily takes in the payload and forwards you silently on to your destination, none the wiser. There's a company called Granicus that does this for the US government for several agencies and departments. They run links.gd. I think GD is not a God complex thing, but they were Gov delivery before. And so what you see here in bold is the third-party forwarding link there, and then the string there is just some base64 encoded text. It's not encrypted; it's totally in the open. Anyone can decode it, and so this opens up a clean approach to a SPET, which would just combine detection of this technique. It's fairly obvious, with some modification of the data, ideally in plausible ways, before any target is visited. So I did that. I just wrote a little script to do this. It took me 5 minutes or something. Developing a script to do it in a more robust way wouldn't be too big of a deal. But the effect of this kind of thing is pernicious. People can't see what the true destination of the link is that they're clicking. That opens up a lot of security issues in addition to privacy ones. It's a problematic practice. Okay, so a different sort of screw you defense is a little less direct. I want to turn to it now. It kind of follows from the insight that to establish stable conditions that are favorable to privacy, you need services that do something without good privacy to be replaced. You can't have a sort of vacuum. And the replacements should be close substitutes that are more private. So here the examples that are easiest are centralized services, like, just to pick two, Twitter and Cloudflare. For Twitter, the case is the clearest, I think, so I took that one. There's already plenty of existing technology for mirror bots. Here's 3 mirrors of the Snowden account on Mastodon off of Twitter. The strategic addition here would be to produce a distributed network of mirroring bots that choose accounts based on their follow counts or some other relevant attributes, and then mirror them systematically to a more private alternative, like, say, Mastodon. Okay, so I'll just say a few words relating transparency tools and screw you defenses, and then wrap up. So first, as mentioned, SPETs come in pairs. Transparency is the first part, and that helps to identify privacy attacks and measure their severity. Screw you defenses are then tailored by the transparency half to be proportional and necessary. Severity, I want to add, can be measured precisely. I haven't sort of added much much that's concrete to that claim, but you can say some precise things about measuring severity of a privacy attack. For example, in anonymity, there are plenty of metrics for measuring that sort of thing. You could use bits of normalized entropy for browser fingerprinting, or in this sort of database privacy context, you could use epsilon in differential privacy. But there are kind of well-developed approaches to measurement in those contexts. And then proportionality of response in the screw you defense would just be an additional step of coming up with a way to measure the severity of the defense. So how much does a website operator expect to lose in ad revenue if 20,000 clients visit and click randomly on its advertisements regularly for a month? Or how many users would adopt another more private service if 10,000 clients mirrored all the privacy and security related content that they could see for a month, and so on. Second, SPETs are distributed, so they're not personal privacy technologies that every user needs to do some other first order task more privately. They're special purpose tools. So one thing that follows from that is we need some kind of a client to coordinate distributed networks of strategic pets. And then thirdly, SPETs use bots. Bots, this is a kind of related to the second point. Bots can be used to seek out privacy attacks and to execute screw you defenses on users' behalf. It's really kind of a matter of what's deployable. There are often existing tools out there, I've tried to point them out where I could, that are pretty mature and that could be used with a few extra protections and a sort of mind toward the strategic approach to create something that's really practical. So to give just a concrete, more resolved picture of how that might look, SPET might follow the model of the kind of at-home distributed computing projects, like Folding at Home was an early one, right? Where you sit with a client as a daemon and wait for some resource availability and then do your job when you perceive as a lull. So instead of folding proteins or whatever, the client can then run measurements of bot blocking, over broad bot blocking, or run its targeted ad clicking bots, or update a warrant canary on as needed, or publish what's learned from other clients in some censorship resistant way. And I'm sure you can imagine plenty of ways to do that. Okay, so last thing here, great, you might think, won't this whole thing just recur at a higher level? Aren't there going to be just attacks against strategic pets and we're going to just go flying away again? There will be such attacks, and I think the design of strategic pets should model them thoughtfully. So that includes legal challenges that make a big showy display of going after some random schmuck. That's to be expected when there's no single operator to be targeted. We've seen this before in cases of file sharing. This was a woman in the US who was forced to pay 1.9 million for 24 pirated songs from Kazaa, which was an old peer-to-peer sharing system. We can anticipate this kind of thing, and it should be part of the design from the beginning. Bot detection and blocking will likely also escalate as well, aided by actors like Cloudflare. But that's, I think, good ground to fight on. Bot blocking actually introduces a lot of issues from other areas that make it favorable, I think, to the bots. It's a little bit like the analog hole problem in intellectual property protection. You sort of ask, how could you prevent someone from pulling out a camera and recording what the human eye would see on a display while a movie that's copyright protected plays? Or maybe more appropriately, how could you prevent someone from reading from some late stage buffer, right, to avoid having to dust off the camcorder? And you can ask the same kind of question about bots. Right? How do you stop a bot that acts as a keyboard and mouse and replays human behaviors without bothering the heck out of non-bot users? Okay, just to conclude, I'm looking forward to some discussion, but I want to say Austin Hill, one of the founders of the defunct privacy-centric tool, Zero Knowledge Systems, said this a while ago. A lot of people think privacy is like the weather. Everybody talks about it, and there's not a lot you can do about it. So the best you can do is build a niche market selling umbrellas. Well, the point here is that those people are wrong. We can move away from personal pets, which act like umbrellas and monsoons, and towards better solutions that are places with better weather. So to make progress, we need strategic tools that work. So our focus should be on being resourceful with existing tools that are mature or that only require some moderate hacking to get working. So I try to point out a few examples of that broadly. So to end where we began then, broadly, privacy is one of the highest ideals of the internet. Makes possible a lot of what the early pioneers in the area saw as its true potential. Your behavior on the internet is not required by law to faithfully predict your future purchasing behavior or your political beliefs or anything else. You're not like some zoo animal who has to act naturally in its confines. There it is. What you do on the internet, who your bots monitor, how you represent the local part of your email address, and so on, that's a part of expression. And that can be harnessed strategically like all expression. So in the words of our esteemed colleague, Emmanuel Goldstein, most of the power remains in our hands and in our minds. So I think hackers should jump in. And happy to take questions now if there are any. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, David. That was an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed a lot of it. We do have some questions from the audience. And the first, we're going to go right into them. So the first question I have for you is, are there considerations for SPETs by jurisdiction, or should we be thinking about their application in a more broad context?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's an advantage for strategic pets that you can, right? So distributed approaches are kind of naturally paired with strategic pets, and distributed approaches can be run across legal jurisdictions. So you can sort of build into the design of these systems a way to escape the grips of a particular legal regime. So I think, I think the answer is we should take a more global approach in the design of the SPET, but I think the sort of threat modeling should be informed by what kinds of things local jurisdictions are trying to do, because there's a lot of variation. And, you know, that might even extend, you know, with, it's not, doesn't have to be international, right? I mean, there's a lot of variation among the states in the United States that can make a difference. So, for example, for transparency and CCPA in California. So it's a good question. I think the answer is sort of, think locally, act globally, something like that, right? Think about the threats that are local and then come up with an approach that circumvents them.
That's right. They say let things start local, for sure. All right, I have another question for you, and we've got about 9 minutes. The next question for you is, you also mentioned Nissenbaum, and she feels about the issues of SPET in a contextual integrity framework. You had mentioned that in your talk.
Yeah, so I'm not relying on any particular model of privacy. So this question is referring to a kind of philosophical framework for understanding privacy. I think that that's valuable in the sense that it forces us to discuss it forces us to discuss privacy kind of in an expansive way. It's a little counterintuitive, but I think sometimes when you try to define things, you end up with a feeling for its diversity that's lost otherwise if you're just very focused on the practical. But I would also say that, yeah, I would also say that this talk is really focused on kind of rubber hits the road technology. You know, that the idea is that we should be aiming for a little bit lower hanging fruit that can be deployed and that can be used by at least some decent number of members of a community. And so very theoretical work can sometimes distract from that in some sense. So I tried to not put too fine a point on it. I don't think anything should turn on how you understand privacy from the perspective of Nissenbaum's theories.
Got it. All right, then. Our next question is, should people run their own mail server to protect their privacy? You know, it's very hard to compete with free mail, but, you know, you give up your privacy.
Yeah, that's interesting. So one place where this came up in the presentation is in creating a forwarding service that allows for fingerprinting in one form or another. And so I mentioned you could run your own mail server that does this and do something like, you know, domain churn with freely available domains and automate the process. So that's a benefit to running your own mail server. That's a kind of strategic reason to run your own mail server. But you know, and I guess to the extent that you're forcing actors in this vast interoperable system to take seriously that there may be individuals running their own mail servers, that's also a benefit, right? You can't just blacklist email domains that aren't familiar enough to you, that aren't big enough players, which is a problem that currently kind of haunts this question. So I guess I would say it's a good, it is a maintenance task. You know, there's a lot of things to consider with respect to, you know, security, attacks on your system, maintenance of your system. So I guess it depends on how much you're interested in the process. But from a strategic perspective, I think there's a reason to do it. Yeah, I do think there's a reason.
Thank you. That's excellent, and I definitely agree with you. One of the things that you mentioned for your privacy that I think is very interesting is using browsers in a VM sandbox, so that you know, they're all self-contained. It's like your own personal spec.
Yeah, well, I mean, so that kind of approach, that's really, yeah, the personal approach to privacy that involves things like isolation that you get from a VM, for example, you know, to varying strengths depending on how you run things. That's really a matter of personal pets. So that's should be distinguished, I think, from this kind of network that is designed to root out and counterattack privacy attacks. So I guess to the extent that you find evidence that there are, you know, exploits in a browser, like an extension, let's say, that is hoovering up lots of your behavior on the web and sending it off to some third party, that, you know, to the extent that you detect that with a transparency tool, that's then reason to target a screw you defense to the company, to try and think of ways to, you know, visit their site and ruin their ad revenue, to to sign up with Sybils to their listservs, to
Sure.
all these kinds of approaches that you can imagine that impose a cost for this attempt to compromise privacy.
Exactly. All right, I'm running out of time, so I have one more question for you. And the question was about back in the day when privacy first started getting some traction, people were appending their emails with PRISM words for that bulk data collection known as PRISM. What's your opinion on that whole show, how that went?
Yeah, that's a really, I'm glad that came up. So there was an early project doing that called Flagger, which is now sort of hard to find. I think there's a repository for it somewhere you could dig up. And it was subsequently taken up more, I guess, prominently by Ben Grosser, who is one of those artists that I mentioned before. And I think it's a pretty clear example of a kind of a proto spec. It's not in a way, it sort of has both dimensions, because the transparency side came out as a result of the Snowden revelations. And so there was some attempt to say, okay, well, we can take this list of watchwords that was released by the DHS and try and append to the content of your email some long string. In the case of Ben Grosser, it was not just appending the words, but it was actually this kind of HMM generated string of sort of grammatical but nonsensical language. And so you'd get these emails, you know, Grandma, I'm coming to tea later. And then at the bottom it would say, you know, bring the anthrax to the, you know, to the drop point, and lots and lots of sinister sounding stuff. And I think that what I like about that case is it dramatizes the problem with running this. You know, that's, as an artistic project, that's amazing, right? Because everyone recoils at the idea of running such a thing, right? You put a big blinking light on your head. It's a kind of privacy protest, and it's a clear message, but it's a high cost, and it's not clear how effective it is, other than the indirect means of affecting maybe policy and to some extent public opinion. But if you want to have a direct effect, if you want to design systems that use that expression more directly, you need to have those same approaches leveraged in a way that hides who's responsible, that protects them from retribution, and is systematic in how its effect is applied.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're out of time now. Thank you very much, David City, PhD student at the University of Arizona. Thank you very much for your presentation on privacy and hacking our privacy. And I really appreciate you coming here on behalf of all the attendees and all the volunteers and everybody here at Hope 2020. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much. Love Hope. Appreciate it.